to bring to the stage Dr. Nick Begich.
Good deals. You know how it works.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Pastor Butch for bringing me down, and I want to thank all of you for being here for this day. You know, this has been an interesting event for me because there's not many that just deal with the issue of mind effects on a lot of different levels, and so I appreciated all the things that our other speakers had to say. And I want to give a little bit more background on myself. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicine. I also work as executive director of the Lay Institute on Technologies, Inc., which is a Texas-based nonprofit that's currently funding a lot of my research, a lot of the things that I'm doing these days with the help of the Lay Institute. I also have 5 children, and in March had a couple of grandchildren. So got a pretty good range in the kids. My youngest is 14. My oldest is just going to be 30 this year. Alaska has done me okay in terms of aging. I know somebody told me today we're expecting an old man, so I'm sorry to disappoint you. The good news is I hope to be around a lot longer to do a lot more work. So with that, I want to get into this issue. I want to start with where really my work began, which goes back to the whole issue of Haarp, because there were other situations with Haarp that caused me a great deal of concern. But let me just give a little bit of background on that. How many have never heard about Haarp before? Okay, not too many. How many have never heard me speak before? All right, well, this will be fun then. So I'll get to deliver a lot of new information to a lot of new people, and I appreciate that. But Haarp was a high-frequency active auroral research project. Gene Manning and I wrote the first major book on the subject called Angels Don't Play This Haarp, which many of you probably have seen. It was an issue that came up years ago. The things that caught me was it was taking place in Alaska, which is, you know, a pretty remote place, but and it's a big place, but it's small in number of population. And my family's been politically involved there for over 50 years. My dad served in the state Senate. He also served in the United States Congress in the 92nd Congress in the early 70s. My brother is currently mayor of Anchorage, serving his 2nd term. My family's been involved at all levels of state, local, and national government. And as a result, we've made a lot of friends, made a few enemies along the way too. I'm, I guess, the black sheep of the family. I tend to be the most conservative in my family. But politics and science in the 21st century really do go together. What makes governments powerful in this century is, in fact, the technology that they command and control. Within democratic republics, it's critical in the 21st century that each of us at least have a conceptual knowledge of what this technology is, what it might do, and where it might go. I mean, how many people today can fix their automobile? You know, not very many of us. You know, a few hands go up, most of us don't. But we can drive it, we conceptually understand it, we can operate it safely. We don't need to know how to build it, but we can still operate. And the same is true with all of our technology. We need to start to take that attitude of, let's learn what we can about the technologies, let's do it in a credible way. One of the things that I became well known for is all of my books are extremely well footnoted. And the reason for that is lay people can take that material, take it to specialists, take it to engineers, who can then go to that material, and it gives it credibility and brings in other people into this fight, because it really is a fight in the direction in which the technologies will go. You know, many have asked me over the years as well, you know, don't you get fearful, because I've taken on military on a number of projects, I've testified all over the world, and the answer is no. I've never experienced any fear in any of my work since I began this work in 1994. And if you call my wife and you said, why is that, she'd tell you, because there are hundreds of people just like you praying for us every day, and it does work, and it does matter. And when you're following your calling and when you're following your mission, there is no fear. There's anxieties occasionally about kids. I mean, when you got a big family and you're traveling around, you're always worrying about your kids. But other than that, it really has been great. I mean, it's been a lot of sacrifice along the way, but none of it would have been possible without each of you. So starting with Haarp, the thing that struck me is here was this system being built in Alaska, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. And this project involved the design of an ionospheric heater. And this was designed by a guy named Bernard Eastland, Dr. Ben Eastland, who I've gotten to know fairly well over the years. In fact, I was with him in March for a few days in a closed conference in Dallas, and I'm going to talk about that towards the end of my presentation. But Dr. Eastland went to Atlantic Richfield, which owned major holdings of natural gas on the north slope of Alaska, and he came to them with a concept for marketing their gas that would actually develop a weapons-based technology by being able to burn the gas in place, run it through what are called magnetohydrodynamic generators, which are simply generators that produce electricity, and then take the electricity and run it through an array, a field of antennas that would then be able to concentrate or focus radio frequency energy into a relatively small area beginning about 30 miles above the Earth's surface called the ionosphere. Now, the ionosphere, for those that listen on shortwave, you couldn't hear it without it. You know, shortwave is what allows those wavelengths to bounce around the curvature of the Earth so you can pick up shortwave literally around the world. So the ionosphere is important for lots of different reasons, communications being the primary reason that most people consider. The ionosphere also is a layer. It extends out several hundred kilometers out from that 30-mile range, and it acts as a shield. It protects the Earth from incoming particle streams, cosmic radiation, various kinds of radiation that would make life impossible on this planet. People worry about ultraviolet radiation because of depletions in ozone. It is nothing compared to if we ever had a chance to lose the ionosphere. I don't believe that will occur. I mean, it's charged up, it's fueled literally by the sun. You get the magnetosphere, which is at, when you look at the Earth and you see around the Earth, in those old high school pictures, when you looked at the Earth, they had these long tail downwind from the sun, and that was the energy essentially interacting with the magnetic fields of the Earth and creating these layers. Now, when you look at the ionosphere, and you look at this graphic, and this is just a small graphic showing a field of antennas focusing the energy up into the ionosphere. What's interesting is anyone who's done any radio engineering knows that radio frequency energy generally would look more like this, starting out narrow and spreading out with distance, just the same way as if I shined a flashlight on the wall. Beam would be small here, it would spread out. That rule applies to energy generally, but when you focus energy, like you can with the laser, where you can concentrate that energy, this is, by analogy, would be very similar. We're concentrating radio frequency energy to create various weapons effects. One of the things that concerned me was sort of how this would play out. And what Dr. Eastland envisioned was this is the Earth in the middle of an energy field that would be designed and developed through many of these systems, literally wrapping around the Earth. In other words, it would cover the entire planet except for the polar regions where the magnetic field lines actually intersect the Earth. The thing that concerned me about this was if you go back in time in terms of research on the issue of ionospheric modification, one of the things that came up from a guy named J.F. Gordon MacDonald, who was a geophysicist at UCLA. He was also a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson when he was president. He had written a chapter in a book in 1969. The book was called Unless Peace Comes. The chapter was called How to Wreck Your Environment, which it was before Earth Day, so I guess they could do that in 1969, and it was politically correct. But what was going on there was a discussion in mid-chapter about the idea of electronically stroking the ionosphere in just the right way to return a signal to the Earth that would influence the behavior of people within the region of that discharge. Now, this gets amplified later in a book that many of you may have seen. It's called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Anybody ever read that book? Oh, come on, nobody in this room? This is a very important book to read, and I'll tell you why. This is one of the guys that formed the Trilateral Commission with Kissinger and Rockefeller and all those guys. This he wrote when he was at Columbia University back in the early 70s. When he wrote the book, it is a forecast of what would happen economically, socially, and politically around the world over the next 30 years. And if you read it today, it's not a forecast, it's a history, because it all happened exactly as he predicted it. Within page 54 and 56 in that range in this publication is a discussion of this very technology of being able to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way to return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal. Now, that issue, that whole issue of manipulating the entire planet using magnetic field lines was also amplified more recently in a paper published in 1995 at Laurentian University by a guy named Persinger. And Dr. Persinger had developed a number of experiments within his lab where he was using magnetic fields to stimulate the brain of his students, or I guess victims, experimental subjects, whatever you want to call them. They would come in, he'd put on a helmet, looked like a big motorcycle helmet, had magnetic solenoids, would stimulate various portions of the brain, and interestingly enough, the kinds of things he could create were what are referred to as out-of-body experiences, with all the full array of all the things that are reported by people who have those experiences. He was able to have UFO abductions with all the experiences of everyone that has those experiences. Now the question for him was, well, obviously this is just a mind effect, something that can be stimulated by the mind, but he said, you know, if we could manipulate the magnetic field lines of the Earth, we could manipulate behavior over huge geographic areas. And he produced a paper in that in 1995, and it was just about the time that we were releasing the first book, Angels Don't Play This Harp, which got into a little bit of this issue. Now, the mind control as a concept actually made the news. How many know The Economist as a publication? Okay, a few. One of the most prestigious publications in the world. The Economist, cover story, May 25th, 2002, The Future of Mind Control. And what this was discussing was the ethical considerations of this technology as it was advancing. I want to go back again a little bit in time. In fact, I'm going to go way back, and I'm going to start to build a foundation for how this science evolved and where it began, and it's going to dovetail into some of the other speakers' comments that you've already heard today. If you go way back to the very beginning, when this was being looked at aggressively, you have to go back to the first serious studies of hypnosis back in the 1880s, when they were really getting into this. By the 1920s, Harvard University had actually set up a lab where they were looking at hypnosis, and they had a guy named George Estabrooks that was in that lab at Harvard doing this work. And what he determined through hypnosis was that 1 in 5 subjects could be brought down to such a deep hypnotic state that they could then fracture the personality deliberately and create the super spy, which is what he was looking for. With 10 months of work with an individual, they could take and create 2 separate personalities, one with full knowledge of this one and this one with no knowledge of anything. So they could send this individual into a third country, was the scenario that he gave, where we could then have a super spy that if he got captured, they'd have absolutely no memory of their former experience. The problem is when you split personalities, you don't put Humpty Dumpty back together again so easily. But this was done by Estabrooks. It actually was written up in his book called Hypnotism. It was written in 1943. It was republished in 1957 and actually amplified. And you'll see these references right there. In fact, he considered that every hypnotherapist should have a stable of this type of experimental subjects for these kinds of experiments, and he encouraged them all over the country. The next book that I ran into, because when I see an author that kind of strikes me, I go to the Library of Congress, I see everything they've ever written, and I'm particularly interested in what they wrote at the end of their life, not so much at the beginning, because I want to know how they summed it all up. And you can get a lot from that. I mean, you can get all the thousands of pages that the guy probably read, neck down into one publication. But what I found, the next publication, 1947, was a book called Spiritism. And it was on spiritual mediums by this same guy, Estabrooks. And all of Estabrooks' work, by the way, by 1935 was classified. It was no longer open to the public except for what he published in these generalized books. But the one on spiritualism was interesting because he believed that it wasn't some other entity coming in, but was some aspect of the individual's personality coming out, which we can all have arguments about that with the guy, but the fact that he was drifting this direction told me a great deal about the underlying aspects of the personality writing this book. The other thing that concerned me was he would continue to say throughout his material, something you hear from the scientific community all the time, if somebody misuses this, it's not my fault, I'm just the scientist. Well, I challenge that, and I challenge it every time I hear it, because anybody being given the gift of that kind of creativity from the Creator himself has an obligation to use it correctly. And when they don't, and when they know it's been misused, they are as guilty as the person that has misused that technology when they've knowingly participated. They continue to indemnify these people. They don't allow you to see who they are. They're the things that are redacted out of these documents. You never find out who they are. And this portion of the military-industrial complex is actually the academic center. This is where a lot of this research takes place, is in our universities with the same people teaching your kids. And I think we have a right to know what kind of business some of these people have been in the past. That science should be much more open than it is today. But going back from Estabrook's work, by the early 1960s, he published another book, and it was on the future of the human mind. And this was in the early 1960s, and what he was recommending in this book was the use of LSD as a therapeutic drug for psychotherapists. If you remember, this is paralleling the time that MK-Ultra and the CIA was using LSD, ketamine, BZ, telepathine, and other hallucinogenic drugs on over 8,000 military men and women, on people on the East and West Coast. And I was looking for a primary source on that when we were writing our first book. And this is one of those interesting stories. You know, when you're looking for something and you know it's out there and you're asking God to give it to you. And I'm in a big book room. It's as big as this room was, a big surplus book room. And I'm telling this guy that I'm telling the story to, I'm looking for this document. I'll never be able to find it. I reach back in this box and unconsciously pull out this publication. Is June 1975, Report to the President by the Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, and in it is an excellent chapter on MK-Ultra. And this I would consider a very good primary source, because it discusses the use of the FBI in California for locating those people that were disenfranchised, isolated from the public, criminals, people that just didn't have advocates for them, and those were the people that were used experimentally. When you start to look at the internal documents that were eventually released by the Central Intelligence Agency, Helms' name pops up, because Helms, who, if you remember, during the Watergate era, was one of the guys booted along the way. Helms' role was to find and to deal with the policy issue of unwitting victims. And their conclusion was, although it was a problem, it was necessary. Because if people knew they were being manipulated, then you couldn't see, in the context of their living experience, how it would affect them. Now, the sad story here is, and as Joyce and many others have covered, the victimization of military personnel, this was one of those areas. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, 8,000 military men and women in this one report alone were said to have been experimental victims without fully informed consent. Now, they can't complain, but we can, and we should. Whether it's an anthrax vaccine going under their skin, we may not like the conflicts that our men and women are in, but we need to defend them like they defend us. When I think about, you know, these are the folks that have no, you know, they don't get to have choices, they only get to take orders. And we need to help make sure that some choices remain intact. What goes under their skin should remain intact. I mean, the fact is, when you see the first military publications on implants that I read was a document called The Revolution of Military Affairs in Conflict Short of War by the U.S. Army War College, suggesting that implants be used for GPS, for locating military personnel in combat. Now, they've gotten a lot more sophisticated now. You can do a lot more with microcircuits than you used to be able to do. But think about it. If you were someone going into combat and you had that option, you might choose that option. I mean, if you got captured, you might want to be located rather rapidly, but you ought to have that choice. And now, you know, when you talk about what one of the earlier speakers was speaking about, microcircuits, RFID, this is, I agree with her, absolutely, the mark of the beast. And it's something that we do need to be vigilant, because when you see military talking about, in the context of that document, they talked about this. They also talked about being able to knock out aircraft using things that would interfere with their avionics, cause them to crash, and we would have plausible deniability because there'd be nothing in the electronics to reveal it. Now, this is interesting because a paper was written in 1989, and what it said in 1989, that you could only bring about the technologies of the revolution in military affairs, what they call the RMA, and if you listen carefully, back when Rumsfeld was around, he used this phrase all the time. And it was a revolution so powerful it was going to be equated to gunpowder in the Middle Ages or atomic weapons in the last century. And that's how the U.S. Army War College characterized it. Now, these are the guys that train our officers in the Army, and what they said is that the American public would object because it would violate constitutional provisions and values. For instance, if you knock down a plane load of terrorists, as an example, there's a question about juries, presumptions of innocence, all of these inconveniences from a military perspective. And the argument in this paper that is being played out today was, well, the Constitution doesn't really go beyond the boundaries of the United States. That's what it said. In other words, it's kind of like your kids hearing all the rules in the house and walking out the front door and leaving them at the doorstep. It doesn't work that way, ladies and gentlemen. Every man and woman in the armed service, everyone in public service, swears an allegiance to that Constitution, and it goes where they go or they don't go. But when you consider the fact that they would go a little bit further even, and they said, because these things conflict with American values, you would think that's where it stopped, and instead it said, no, we need a scenario where Americans will set aside those values in exchange for safety and security. And they said it would be in an environment of fear predicated on international terrorism and international drug trafficking. That was 1989. Go look it up. If you don't want to look it up, it's on the CD-ROM that's in the Mind Control DVD as an ancillary document, so you can read it yourself. The interesting part of all that is, look at how many column inches in your newspapers are dedicated to international terrorism, international drug trafficking, and yes, there are problems, but let's look at terrorism as the one that, we're all in this orange alert status today, whether we know it or not. I just came through the airport, so I know. Does it make you feel comfortable? No. You know what fear does to brain coherence? It totally dissipates it. If you look at an EEG of people experiencing fear, anger, hate, or any of the negative emotions, you will see incoherent brain patterns, the kind that will never lend themselves to good decision making. Just the opposite is true when you experience the emotions of love, compassion, empathy. You get very coherent, rhythmic patterns, the kind that unify the creative and the intellectual side of the brain and allow us to function as God intended us to. Not in fear. Fear is our adversary, and those that use fear to motivate are fundamentally wrong. And they may be just deceived, but they're fundamentally wrong. When you look at fear, the natural response is to warn you, but not to drive you forever. I mean, we live in this environment of fear. Think about it. Same thing Hitler used. You're in the middle of a depression. People are worried. They have their rallies at night after everybody's been working all day. We have the equivalent of the rally at night when we go home and watch the 6 o'clock news and get locked in front of a television set that pacifies us and programs us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But let me go back. Again, I go back in time, back to the Korean conflict. And during the Korean conflict, we had a whole bunch of servicemen that were prisoners of war come back, and they started exhibiting all this bizarre behavior. And so the phrase brainwashing was coined. Some of you are old enough to remember this. They were like passing out communist leaflets to the street corners. I mean, they were doing things that just didn't fit. And then we got really interested in this in the 1950s. And that's where these programs started to escalate. There was a problem in academic institutions. A lot of the really bright minds were nonconformists. If any of you have ever worked around a lot of genius personalities, they are really bizarre people. I mean, they are. And that's not meaning in a derogatory sense, although some of them I would probably have to say in a derogatory sense. But nonetheless, they tend to be very non-conforming. That's what sort of makes them who they are. But they don't fit well in academic institutions. So they set up other organizations. One of them in particular was called the Mankind Research Association. How many have ever heard of that group? They were in Silver Spring, Maryland. They operated for about 40 years under a guy named Schleicher. I knew their Northwest field director. And have gotten to know him over the years. And when you talk about a cult, this guy was buried in it. And all of these guys dealt with the very edges of things. And when I started looking at mind control as an issue, mind effects as an issue, the main emphasis and the emphasis most people hear is about controlling individuals. It wasn't about that. That was a part of it, absolutely part of it. But you know what they found that was the most frightening of all? Was what was in the consciousness capacity of individuals, what they discovered about our capabilities as human beings created in the image of the Creator. You remember those words 2,000 years ago? Greater things you shall do also. If you have faith, you can move mountains. Those are the capabilities that I believe the military is most fearful of. Because in fear, you can't exhibit those capabilities. You can't do it when you're beaten up, knocked down, and drug out. You can only do it when you're in your optimum condition the Creator intended for all of us. I think that's the underlying root of it. In the last 4 or 5 months, as I began to think more about this, it becomes even more clear that the reason to continue to create fear in our culture is to inhibit what I believe is otherwise necessary to manifest. The counter to all of this, people say, what can we do? We're doing it. We're first learning what we need to know. Then we're going to equip ourselves with the proper tools, and everyone in this room, I hope, knows those tools. And it's recognize where the spiritual power, the real power is on this planet and where it comes from. That will change it. That is the only thing that will change it, because these technologies are incredibly, incredibly powerful. I want to talk about a little more about where this thing evolved. There was a guy named Jose Delgado. How many have never heard of him? Okay, got a few. Okay, Jose Delgado wrote this book, Physical Control of the Mind Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society. This was written in 1969. Jose Delgado got his degree in electrophysiology from the University of Madrid in 1950. He came to the United States essentially to map the brain, to determine what parts of the brain were responsible for what. He was doing this at Yale University, and what he came up with was a number of things. The first things that got notoriety was he implanted electrodes in primates, humans, and bulls, among others, and then would see what they would do, how to stimulate them with electric current, see what they would do. In one demonstration that he's famous for, in fact, it's in the book, is a charging bull is coming at him, and he flips a switch, and the bull stops right in front of him. And it required an implant technology. By the 1980s, he had figured out a way to do this without any implant at all, without any physical contact at all, using radio frequency energy, the stuff of Haarp, incidentally, radio frequency energy, at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces, because the Earth produces radio frequency energy also. Now let me put that in perspective. Around us right now, in just the radio frequency regime, there is 200 million times more radio frequency energy surrounding us at this moment than the Earth creates. 200 million times more created by man. All right, so over the last 100 years, we've developed all these technologies, and that's what we have swirling around us at the moment. Think about this for a minute. At 1/50th of that level, or 1/10 billionth of the man-made level, the human body and the human mind is capable of picking out a signal 1/50th of what the Earth produces, that faint little signal, and will respond to it like flipping on and off a light switch, from passive to highly aggressive to passive to highly aggressive, demonstrated by Delgado. Now that was back in 1985 when he was demonstrating RF effects. In 1969, he still required implants. When you think about it, a lot of things can be used to carry an electromagnetic signal. There's an incredibly good article. It's also at the U.S. Army War College. It's in their quarterly called Perimeters. And the article is called "The Mind Has No Firewalls." Anybody read that article? Got to read that article. I'll read you a quote from it and kind of get it in a nutshell, because it'll give you the sense of it. It's a multi-page article. It's got a lot in it. But here's essentially what it says. A psychotronic generator produces a powerful electromagnetic emanation being capable of being sent through telephone lines, TV, radio networks, supply pipes, and incandescent lamps. This signal would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal. In other words, any electromagnetic carrier, whether it's the magnetic field lines of the Earth that I mentioned earlier, or the power grid rolling through your home, or the radio broadcast, or the internet connection, it doesn't matter. Any of these can carry a signal in that will manipulate the behavior of people. Now, I'm not talking about specific thoughts or ideas, but stimulating those portions of the brain that are responsible for various emotional effects. Now, how could this be used? Well, let's suppose that there's an international event, and let's suppose that and this is Persinger at Laurentian University suggesting this scenario. Suppose we broadcast a very complex signal through the environment that created an underlying sense of agitation, anger, and fear. And then that night on the 6 o'clock news, we indicted a specific group of individuals or people like Muslim terrorists. And we turned all that anger their direction. And this was the scenario that Persinger pointed out that would be highly, useful and could be delivered with today's technology. Now, any system can be used, and that's important to note, because the systems are changing pretty radically. But it goes well beyond this. There's an article, and this article appeared in an Air Force publication. The publication is called Technology Horizons, and I'm sure you all read this one. It's Air Force Research Labs report. And the June 2004 issue was the cover story was what's called controlled effects. And controlled effects deal with hardware, software, and people. From the hardware standpoint, controlled effects overriding electronic circuits. From the software standpoint, interfering with the flow of information to cause errors so that data gets distorted. And then ultimately, the human operator is discussed here, and it's discussed by the Electromagnetic Directorate of the Air Force at Kirtland Air Force Base. And I'm just going to read a couple of lines out of this to get it in perspective. And let me just read. The controlled effects challenge focuses on new revolutionary technologies to significantly enhance these capabilities and determine how the technologies could change the face of military conflict over 20 to 50 years. And it says, with the advent of directed energy and other revolutionary technology, the ability to instantaneously project very precise amounts of various types of energy anywhere in the world can become a reality. Targets of military significance include facilities, equipment, and personnel, and communications information systems. It goes on to say, controlled personnel effects investigates technologies to make selected adversaries think and act according to our needs. It goes on to say on the next page something even more startling. It says, by studying and modeling the human brain and nervous system, the ability to mentally influence or confuse personnel is also possible. Through sensory deception, it may become possible to create synthetic images or holograms to confuse an individual's visual sense, or in a similar manner confuse his sense of taste, smell, sound, or touch. In other words, to create synthetic images so real you cannot distinguish them from something that was your own memory. Now, transferring sound goes way back to the 1960s. You go back to the 1960s, a guy named Alan Fry demonstrated the first demonstration of what was called microwave hearing. And it was a series of clicks and buzzes that he thought eventually you might be able to carry information on. I demonstrated in the European Parliament in an open hearing a device that did this. It required a physical contact to the body, but actually transferred sound through the nervous system into the brain. It was during our testimony on Haarp, and I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I will tell you what ended up happening is we did get a resolution out of the European Parliament. It was one of the most significant, in fact, the most significant resolution they'd ever passed on security and disarmament in Europe. And in one of the sections, sections 27, which followed the sections on Haarp, I'm going to just read the one-liner, and this is from European Parliament Resolution A40005/99, and section 27 says, and I quote, calls for an international convention introducing a global ban on all developments and deployments of weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings, unquote. Now, why did they do it? Anyone who's been around politics very long knows that there's a couple of ways to short-circuit the system, and one is called co-option and the other one called preemption. And co-option is where you get the leadership to go along with you, and then the people follow. Preemption is where if they're not going to go along with you, destroy their credibility, and then the people will abandon them. So imagine someone standing up and saying they heard this little voice in their head as a national leader. The show would be over, right? And if you're going to influence national governments, this would be the population you would first target, would be the leadership, to confuse the leadership, to create these problems. In the more sophisticated governments, you can't get away with it because everybody's doing the same kind of research, and the research has been going on long enough. There's another quote, well, along that line, anybody ever hear of Woody Norris? He won the MIT Lemelson Prize in 2005, $500,000 for doing what's called acoustic heterodyning, where he was able to send, like my voice, into your head specifically, a person like in a room like this. You'd hear it, and no one else around you would. Now, he has a public company. It's traded on the exchange. You can look it up. Their symbol is ATCO. He's not a bad guy. He's just a creative guy that came up with something. They want to put these in stores, so that you can walk into a zone and kind of get this deal in your head. They want to use this kind of technology where you walk by the vending machine and it says, have a Pepsi. You know? I mean, you got to think about some of the technologies as they're evolving, because this guy validated his science to MIT's satisfaction, and that was the first time we saw it really out there in the open literature in a way that you can't refute, the idea that this could be done. It wasn't projected to be possible until 2020 by the Air Force, and I'm going to quote another document. This is Air and Space for the 21st, New World Vistas, Air and Space for the 21st Century, the ancillary volume from the Science Advisory Board of the Air Force from 1996, and it says, and I quote, "It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body, raising the possibility of covert suggestion and psychological direction. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion that would be most disturbing to them," unquote. I would say so. Talk about disturbing. I mean, everyone in this room, if you heard that voice, what would you think? What kind of illusions could be created with that? We can all use our imaginations and go an awful long distance. The fact is, it's not just old news. It's not just old research. The most current document I'm going to quote from today is it expires September 30th, 2009. So it's 2 years before it's over. This is a federal agency issuance of what's called an RFP, a request for proposals. This is from the Air Force Research Labs. It's an open proposal now. It's their number BAA05-05HE, and it's research in support of the Directed Energy Bioeffects Division of the Human Effectiveness Directorate, which is the guy who wrote the articles on controlled effects a couple years before. But the important thing is they get into the whole idea of gaining this knowledge of bioeffects, and then it says on the non-lethal weapons side, the ultimate goal of such research is to develop a fully articulated theory with supporting predictive models that will facilitate the inducement of desired behavioral effects in individuals and groups through the use of non-lethal weapons. The way they're going to bring these about, and these are dual-use weapons. Dual-use meaning domestic as well as to be used overseas. And the reason I know this is because in the 1990s, the DOD and the DOJ had a series of meetings, actually going back to the 80s, a series of meetings, and by 1994 had agreed on a joint protocol for the advancement of what are called non-lethal weapons. All of these things fit into that category, and the priority funding would go to those that had dual use. Department of Justice for riot control purposes, and DOD for obvious reasons. The other thing that comes out is, if you remember, September 13th, 2006, we had the Secretary of the Air Force, Wynne, W-Y-N-N-E, say that all non-lethal weapons will be tested on Americans before they were deployed overseas. Do you remember that? Well, here we are, ladies and gentlemen. It's not 1984, but it might as well be. You know, the issue is these technologies, as they're deployed, think about it. They call it the CNN effect. When we see all the carnage and all the nonsense that goes with warfare, it makes us sort of say, hey, is this really the right option or the last option? When you take that out, you know, you keep hearing this saying from George Bush, I want to win their hearts and minds, and he is not kidding. You know, I believe that's a literal statement. It's almost like a joke that he gets to play on the public every time he says it. Because ultimately, we're going to demand a different approach. We already are. This is the fulfillment of that demand if they begin to utilize these technologies to pacify that nation. Now I'm down to 5 minutes. Man, this is the quickest lecture I've given in an awful long time. I want to hit at least a couple of more major points. Well, let me just hit a couple of things. It's not the only direction this technology can go, and this is something that I really want to amplify. The dark side of this is no darker than a bomber dropping bombs on your house, you know? I mean, it can also deliver you to the lecture, you know? It depends on the operator. What we have, though, is a group of people that believe that they have a right to impose their will on us. The idea of being able to manipulate an individual without their fully informed consent. I don't care if it's our adversary or not. Interference with free will is something God does not do, and it is something that we should not do. When you look at the people behind the technology, they are some dark, dark souls. They have used the excuse of, it's not me, it's the other guy that does it, long enough. We need accountability. They are watering down the Freedom of Information Act. They have totally gutted the federal whistleblower programs. They are totally worthless. The guy in charge of whistleblowing programs had whistleblowers blow the whistle on him, and now they're trying to figure out how to create another agency to watch that one. We need whistleblowers. We need truth, and with that truth, we also need to have the capacity to forgive. And that's going to be all of our challenge. What worked in South Africa in the recent past, they had truth commissions. People were allowed to come forward, spill their guts, tell the truth, gain forgiveness, and those that didn't, that were implicated, went to prison. And that's what we need. We need a period of time where bureaucrats, corporate people, people out there who have done this work can clear their conscience, come forward, be protected, be insulated by the right institutions so that the truth can be heard and we can have a chance at a different direction. We'll never have it as long as they can operate in darkness, and that darkness has increased. We are becoming increasingly transparent as human beings, whether it be through RFID tags, whether it be through our manipulation of data, or whether it be through Pentagon programs like LifeLog. How many heard about LifeLog? They want to track every bit of public data and private data that they could collect on every one of us from birth to death. And it got stomped out. It's been tried in several different arenas on several different names. They are doing it. I talked on radio recently about quantum computers, and I'm going to wrap up with this because I think it's important. Computing today, you know, when you look at computing today, the supercomputers of today can map only one neuron firing chain in the human brain in real time in 3 dimensions using 3 supercomputers at once, all tied together. They're doing this in Switzerland right now. Now, think about this for a moment. How big is a supercomputer? And I've said this on radio a number of times, so some of you have heard this. The supercomputers, the highest speed tested last year, June 30th, 2006 at Lawrence Livermore Labs, was 280.6 teraflops a second, which doesn't mean anything to most of us in the room. So let me put it in an illustration that will. In that 1 second, it would be the equivalent, in 1 second, the equivalent of 6.6 billion people with hand calculators every 5 seconds doing a calculation for 60 hours. Okay? Think about that. Hold that in your head for a moment. Now that is the computer of today that can only, 3 of them together can only map 1 neuron firing chain in the human brain in real time in 3 dimensions. Quantum computers will do what the computer I just described, if it were to be running for 1 trillion years, a quantum computer will do it in 1 hour. The first workable quantum computer was tested this year. Commercial versions will be available within a few years. They say by 2010, 2011. That means all encryption will be obsolete. You'll be able to hack every encryption code. Whoever wins this race first controls this planet's information systems, which means it controls the economy. It controls every aspect of your life, whether you like it or not, because quantum computers make that leap. They will seem so unreal in their predictive capacity because of what they'll be able to crunch. They can take all the data in the world and crunch it in moments and be able to analyze that data and come up with predictions that seem supernatural. And that's what's coming with quantum computers. Whoever controls that technology will rule this planet. And we're there. We're there now. What we do, what happens in the next few years is going to decide a great deal about the future. But here's the good news. That quantum computer I just described, that can only, 3 of the supercomputers can only map 1 neuron firing chain. Do you realize that each of us in this room is, in fact, a quantum computer? Our brain has more computing capacity than the computer I just described. If we could just, by the grace of God, access our capacities, and I believe we can, then everything will change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Man, one after another, how do you follow that act? Holy mackerel. You know what? I think he's right, though. I think that every single one of us has the capacity to tap into a source that is so powerful, that is all-powerful. And I don't think that any computer made by man can ever even come close to matching that. Of course, we can't do it by ourselves. So where does that power come from?